the fourth, but Jimmy, to his friends and fellow hikers, serves as an associate justice on the North Carolina Supreme Court. I got to know Jimmy when I was clerking for his father on the Fourth Circuit, and regularly appeared before him when he served on the North Carolina Utilities Commission, and have hiked with him many times, including the one that I'll be talking about tonight. He is a member of the South Beyond 6,000 Club that some of you may have heard of, having hiked to the summit of all 40 peaks above 6,000 feet in the Southeast. Henry Farr is an attorney in the Charlotte office of Offutt Kerman. Henry has accomplished a hiking feat that I not only have never heard of, but quite frankly, had never even imagined, which was he has reached the highest point of all 100 counties in the state of North Carolina. And we'll hear about one of those treacherous hikes to, I think he said, an elevation of 6 feet this evening. Now, of all the panelists, I've known Leslie Neidick the longest. She was a law school classmate of mine at UNC School of Law, class of 1989. She's practiced mostly in the area of criminal defense and immigration, and is currently working for the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants in the North Carolina field office. Raised on the Hudson River in New York before coming south, Leslie is an accomplished athlete and avid outdoorsman her entire life. She's hiked, paddled, and pursued outdoor adventures throughout North Carolina and the world, but we'll be talking tonight about discovering some great hikes right in your own backyard. Again, my name's Grace Stiers. I practice law in Raleigh with the firm of Fox Rothschild, where I co-chair its National Energy and Natural Resource Practice Group. In full disclosure, and if you haven't heard already, and most of you have, I'm also a candidate on the ballot in November for judge on the North Carolina Court of Appeals. And I'm proud to have been endorsed by the North Carolina Sierra Club. Our discussion tonight will last about 1 hour. I know we're already a few minutes late. Whether we have time for questions will depend on really how long-winded we all are. Everyone on the call will be muted, but if you can submit your questions, make comments, or share your own stories through the chat feature in Zoom. If we have some question time at the end, Nick will let us know and we'll answer your questions if we have time. After we finish up, a little bit after 6:30, Justice Ervin will be signing off and leaving the call, as any or all of you may as well. But if you would like to stay online for a few minutes, the Zoom will stay open, and I'm going to stick around and talk a few minutes about my background and why I'm running for judge, as well as about my campaign. I'll be glad to answer any questions that you have about my candidacy at that time, but we'll save politics until after the program's concluded, but you're welcome to stay on the Zoom for that. Without further ado, I'll turn the virtual podium over to my good friend and hiking buddy, Woody Kinnett. Woody, I think you're still on mute.
Thank you, Gray. I appreciate you asking me to participate. I'm really honored to be here. And I want to tell you a little bit about my favorite North Carolina trail. It's one that I fell in love with after it nearly killed me. Back in the fall of 1971, when I was 19 years old, I finagled a way to get course credit for spending 11 weeks hiking the Appalachian Trail. My hiking partner was a college classmate, and to say that we were clueless would be an understatement. Cliff had never slept outdoors before. What he knew of backpacking came from reading Cullen Fletcher's famous book, The Complete Walker. What I knew of backpacking came from Cliff. I paid $17 for a pair of mail order boots from REI, and we set off from Mount Katahdin on Labor Day, headed south, figuring we could average about 28 miles a day, and we would be at Springer Mountain by Thanksgiving. Now, to our defense, at that time, fewer than 60 people had ever hiked the whole Appalachian Trail, so there just wasn't anybody around to tell us that we were doing it all backwards, going in the wrong direction, and that we should be starting out in early spring in Georgia headed north, rather than at Mount Katahdin at Labor Day headed south. It just doesn't work that way. But back then, there were sections of the trail that you could walk for days on end without seeing another person. We were getting a course credit for botany, and that required us to carry a giant leaf press. We had not anticipated how early fall comes in the Maine woods, But after 3 weeks of hiking through Maine with all the leaves off the trees, we realized that we were going to need to skip further south if we were going to collect successfully and identify the 150 species of trees and shrubs in order to pass the course. So we hitchhiked from Maine down to Fontana Dam at the southern end of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And from there, we hiked north to the Virginia border. In those days before GPS and detailed trail maps, we were carrying a state highway map. We had no idea what lay along the trail between the highway crossings. Late one afternoon in early November, we climbed over Roan Mountain and down into Carver's Gap. The sun was starting to set, and the trail sign told us that there was a shelter on Grassy Ridge Bald about 2.5 miles further north. That particular shelter is long gone, but in those days it was there. And so we headed out over the balds, and the trail was very heavily rutted. We found ourselves slogging through water in the twilight, and it was dark by the time we got to the shelter. We pulled off our soggy boots and boiled up another package of dehydrated beef stroganoff and headed off to bed in our sleeping bags. During the night, though, a cold front came through, and it was about 10 degrees by the time we woke up the next morning. Our boots were frozen solid. There was just no way to thaw them out, to soften them up enough to put them on our feet. There was no firewood out on those balds, and our cooking fuel was running low. There was nobody to call for help, and in those days, there were no cell phones to make the call with. Slowly, we realized that we were in some trouble, and our only choice really was to hunker down in our sleeping bags, do our best to stay warm and conserve energy and wait for the weather to break. And that's what we did. We powered down, lay side by side in that shelter, and for the next 2.5 days, we talked about every imaginable subject. Cliff had a photographic memory for every joke he had ever heard. And on top of that, his father had been a Church of God pastor in a succession of hillbilly communities in West Virginia. Cliff was able to imitate the sayings and mannerisms of just about every parishioner who had walked through the church doors. So to this day, many of my old standby jokes and stories come from that time with Cliff as we bunkered in survival mode there in that shelter. Eventually, the temperatures rose above freezing to where we could get those icy boots on our feet and continue our hike. That was 49 years ago, and in the decades since then, I've walked that stretch between Carver's Gap and Highway 19E many times, and I will never forget those days on my first visit that I had spent with Cliff in survival mode. Since then, I've traveled to some stunning places, the Milford Track in New Zealand, the Oat Route in Switzerland. And I can tell you that trail section is one of the most gorgeous walks in the whole world. It's my favorite in North Carolina, and we're lucky to have it so nearby. Now, I see we've got among our guests today, Jay Lutze, who is probably single-handedly responsible for saving Yellow Mountain from development. Jay, would you be willing to say a thing or two about Yellow Mountain and that particular trail section?
Nick, can you unmute Jay and maybe pull back up that map at the very end, which has Yellow Mountain on it? If you can identify Jay, he's on my screen, 4th row, 5th over.
Yep, Jay, you should be able to unmute yourself.
I think I'm unmuted now. Yeah, that's a great story, Woody. I love it. That was my childhood, getting stuck in places, not for 2.5 days, but getting myself into trouble up in the Roan Highlands. And I'm on Big Yellow Mountain right now. I was out working on a section of trail today with my nephew, who's working with me at Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy. And I sent a picture of the sunset last night to a friend in Massachusetts. And he said, wow, that's a really beautiful place. And I said, it's worth fighting for. And that's my journey has been one of falling in love with special places and then fighting for them. And that's what happened in the Putnam Mine case. And it was a great day when I met Ron Howell and Forrest Farrell, and Judge Farrell became the attorney on the case along with Southern Environmental Law Center. And the state had violated the Mining Act of 1971. And it's a great reminder that the places that we fall in love with, even after you protect them, even after Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy bought 26,000 acres of this landscape and transferred it to the National Forest System, you still have to keep fighting for the values that you care about. And it's a lesson in the power of the law. And it's an honor to be on this call with so many people who are committed to that value.
Thank you, Jay. I appreciate that. I remember when you were an incoming first-year law student at UNC School of Law, they had a orientation for incoming 1Ls, and Jay had the misfortune of having some mentors in that orientation, but it was my good fortune to get to know Jay as his mentor as 1L orientation coming into UNC Law School. And if you're interested more in how Jay and lawyers and judges saved Yellow Mountain, I'll make a pitch for his book, Stand Up That Mountain. You can find it on Amazon and your local bookstore. So I would highly recommend that.
Great.
Jimmy, you want to chime in with a short story about an adventure you had on top of Roan Mountain? And you're on mute, Jimmy. Jimmy, you need to unmute.
There we go. Every time I do this, it changes how you're supposed to unmute yourself. I had the one experience, I've been up there a lot, and it is one of the best places in the world to go. Jay and I talk about this with some regularity when we see each other, but very briefly, I was up there maybe 5 years ago at Christmas with my two children and had the experience that Woody might have had he not been fortunate. We were hiking up there on the day after Christmas in a deep fog where you couldn't see anything, and the wind was blowing 40 miles an hour on the top of Grassy Ridge. When we got up there and decided we were going to try to get out of the wind and eat some lunch, as we saw a rock formation slightly over the crest back on what I now know is the North Carolina side, we saw this person lying there and thought to ourselves, well, we don't really want to disturb this guy who's lying on top of Grassy Ridge for some reason known only to God. And then when we got over there, we realized he was deceased. And so I have had the misfortune of finding a dead body on the top of Grassy Ridge. I don't think about it when I go up there very much, but it's, Woody, I'm glad I didn't find you instead of this person who had apparently wandered off and got lost. You should try getting emergency assistance up there on the day after Christmas. Nobody was particularly interested, but we finally got some law enforcement up there.
The adventures you have on the trails. So John, if you'll unmute yourself, I don't think you've got quite anything quite that adventuresome, but love to hear about your trail.
Well, I was thinking about the term sober as a judge, and I've never heard a more sober comment about the trail than Jimmy just gave us. First of all, I would like to thank Jay. I think we're all grateful to him for his action. And Jay, we deeply appreciate what you've done, as well as the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy. I would also like to plug the Conservancy and one of its newer trails, the Everett Bowman Trail, which is not very far from Yellow Mountain or Roan Mountain. Everett was an attorney in Charlotte. He was a law partner of Graham Holding, who is one of my intrepid hiking buddies. Graham and I and the Intrepids hiked the Everett Bowman Trail at Elk Pasture up to Elk Pasture Falls last fall, and had a wonderful time. And it is with great gratitude and indebtedness that we thank you, and we appreciate what you've done. My talk is about the Black Balsam area, and you're looking at a view just above Graveyard Fields. That is the Yellowstone Prong River or stream that is in front of us. And on the horizon, you're looking up towards Ivester Gap. And if we might move to the next slide, I'll tell you a little more. This is still on the Blue Ridge Parkway. The trailhead for Black Balsam and the area around Sam's Knob that I'm going to talk about is about 45 miles southeast of Asheville, just off Blue Ridge Parkway, milepost 420. There's a Forest Service road that goes in that point, Forest Service Road 816. You don't really have to remember that. It's the first Forest Service road that you come to that's paved. But if you take the Forest Service road, and we'll go to the next slide. Next slide. We're on the Forest Service road now. We're looking back to the southeast. In the middle, you can see Looking Glass Rock. You can see the parkway as it winds back down the mountain. And in the area in the left hand, that the brownish gray area, that's an area called Graveyard Fields, which is a great hiking camping area and was burned to a crisp twice, once around about 1925 and once in the 1940s. Next slide, please. This is a map. I wanted to orient you briefly. If you go to the middle right, just about where Jimmy's left lower corner comes in, that's the Forest Service road that winds its way down and up to the point called Gate. The last photograph viewed just about where Blacktop Road was, or is mentioned there, to the southeast. Our hike is going to begin at the Gate, and we're going to hike Sam Knob Trail. There's a flag half a mile out, and the trail leads up to Sam Knob, which is a 6,010-foot peak, and one of the 6,000 foot peaks that folks like to hike and brag about. The trail then goes down to Flat Laurel Creek, and that's where most of the slides will end. You can see that the trail leads all the way to the left to Highway 215. It will connect with the Mountains to the Sea Trail, which is green, and the Art Loeb Trail, which is purple, back to the old road, the Forest Service Road. And there's a trail in the middle, which is Little Sam Knob, and a trail that's red around the meadow. All of these trails are within that hour drive from Asheville. They're all at about an elevation of about 5,700 feet. They will feature in various forms a mountain meadow, a 6,000-foot peak with a 360-degree view, a high mountain stream with brook trout. The trails themselves are made up mostly of old logging railroads, railroad beds. There are 3 ruins of logging camps in the area. You will find cable that's 1.5 inches thick that was used with an overhead log skidder back in the 19-teens and 1920s. You will hike on a trail and you might find yourself in a coal pile rather than on a trail. That's how the steam engine and the railroads got along. There's a waterfall on the lower part of Sam Knob Trail, and you can have a view all the way to South Carolina on the Mountains to the Sea Trail. This is the trailhead. This is my hiking crew. They're also my neighbors, Gar and Meg and Cassie and Ridge and Graham. Now, those of you down east that are kind of worried about hiking up in the mountains, I want you to look at Ridge and Graham there. They're twins and they're about 4 years old, and they hiked this 6,000-foot peak. Go to the next slide, if you will. And they ran out ahead of me and got way ahead on this trail. When I was putting hikes together for the Bar Association, one of the issues was, Mason, you got to get a flat trail. These people are flatlanders. These boys are from New York City and Winston-Salem. Gar's dad is a retired lawyer, George Ragland, with the old Womble firm. And his grandchildren have been an absolute joy to me because they're my neighbors. The mountain to the right, that's Sam's Knob. That's where we're going. Next slide, please. This is, again, our map. This is where we are. We've just come across the meadow here, and we're going up to Sam's Knob. Next slide. We're atop Sam's Knob. Now, you might notice that my hiking crew has changed. This is Patrick and Caitlin and Luke and Claire and Isla. And down in the left-hand corner is my dog Champ's rear end. He's a hiker too. We are looking from atop Sam's Knob into the valley below, which we have just hiked across. If you look to the right, again, it's right next to Jimmy's microphone. That's Flat Laurel Creek. If you notice in the background, just about under my ears, you've got a tree line there. That is what the mountaineers call black balsam. That's a combination of red spruce and Fraser fir. If you can imagine, back in 1910, this whole area in the background was covered with black balsam. It was logged by the Sunburst Lumber Company. Their slash piles would caught fire and burned the area to a crisp to a depth of about 10 inches and destroying all of the organic matter. That's why we have a mountain meadow. This is my second hiking crew, and this is looking north from the mountaintop, and that is a mountain ash in berry. This is in early September. They have wonderful white flowers in the spring and these red-orange berries in the fall. That's a little bit past peak, but this is another sunny day on top of the mountain. Next slide, please. This is the actual Flat Laurel Creek, which is a high mountain stream. Some of the bar hikes, we have actually found brook trout in there. Next slide. And this is my original hike. The Raglands, my neighbors, and these three young hikers in the middle. They are 4, 6, 7 years, 8 years old there, and they've already hiked one of the 6,000-foot peaks in the mountains here. Next slide, please. We're back to the map, and hopefully we've got 2 pictures left. If you notice the area, yeah, here we go. This is between Silvermine Bald and Chestnut Ball. You're looking out over the parkway, and we're right off the mountains to the sea trail. You're looking a little bit southeast now. This is one of the magnificent views of this area. You can tell it's in the early spring. Go to the next slide, please.
John, that's the last one we've got.
Okay, if that's it, that is the that's all I'm going to say. All of us involved love the great outdoors, and it's a wonderful place, and you will be healthier and happier and live a longer life if you spend time out there. Amen.
Preach it, John, preach it. Now we'll go to our Justice Irvin.
Well, and I can't top these two anyway. I'm not sure after listening to their discussions that I even belong here, but I have certainly enjoyed the opportunity to get out in the North Carolina mountains all of my life. One of the benefits of living in Morganton is that you can look out your front door and see the ridge that forms the southern side of Linville Gorge. And I've been very fortunate to spend lots of time here. I have got a couple I want to talk about. The first one is labeled here the Real Coal Mountain. It's actually pretty close to the area that John was just talking about. It's also in the Great Balsam Mountains down south of Asheville along the Blue Ridge Parkway. Coal Mountain is in fact a mountain. It is not a town as was depicted in the novel or the movie of the same name. And it's one of my numerous favorite hikes. It's one that I've done a couple of times with my two children, once in the summer and once in the late fall. I will tell you that if you look at most guidebooks, they don't speak very well sometimes of Coal Mountain. But if you go up there in the late fall, November, early December, it is a spectacular place to see off the top. If you look at the trail map that we've just brought up, this is a fairly tough hike. It's a total of about 10, a little bit over 10 miles round trip. You've got a 2,700 foot elevation gain. It starts at the Black Mountain Campground, which is in rural Haywood County. In ascent, you go up on the so-called Art Loeb Trail for a good distance. John alluded to the Art Loeb Trail. It's one of the great classic trails in North Carolina. It starts down around Brevard and runs for the second half over the Shining Rock area and ends at the foot of Coal Mountain. Any part of that trail is a great trail. The beauty of this to me is, even though it is a pretty good uphill trail for a long way, you can see a lot off the top when you get there. And the trip up there is pretty interesting too. You come up some creek beds that go along a ridge, and then you get to the place where the Art Loeb Trail goes off, as you can see on the map. That's in a gap where obviously, I don't know much about the history of it, but obviously many years ago, somebody lived in that gap, because you can see what I remember the second time we went up there in November, seeing apple trees with apples on them. And one of my children, who fancies himself as a rock climber, climbed up one of the trees and bit into the apple, which was rotten to the core. And I remember him throwing it down in disgust, saying that about ruined his day. But we did get up to the top, and it was an absolutely spectacular place. The other hike that I want to mention briefly is the hike from Big Creek to Mount Camerer. Mount Camerer is the home of a fire tower out in the Great Smoky Mountains. It's right off of I-40 when you near where you cross the state line from North Carolina into Tennessee, again in Haywood County. To me, the best place to start is at Big Creek, as this map indicates. You then go for about a little bit more than 2 miles until you intersect the Appalachian Trail, which runs the length of the Great Smokies. As you go through there, one of the really interesting things about it is there's a little community at the foot of that trail. Not many people know this, but when the Smokies National Park was created from an area that was fairly heavily populated for the mountains. And so there are the remnants of all kinds of little communities in there, some of which have been preserved and some of which have not. This is one that has not, but 9 or 10 families lived in there. You can still see the old house foundations. The last time I was through there, you could see the remnants of fences that dated from the 30s when the property was sold to the National Park Service. And you can see flowers and ornamental plants that you wouldn't ordinarily find out in the middle of nowhere, which would be further indication that people actually live there. But you go up the trail from Big Creek to the Appalachian Trail, then you go about another 3 miles until you get to the side trail going to Mount Camerer. We can get to the next slide, please. And when you get to the end of it, you see this structure, which is an old, almost Western style fire tower. It's made of very interesting rock work. The original part of it was built in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps when the park was created. It was restored in the late 1990s. And it sits on the end of a very long sort of knife-like ridge, and you can see forever off of up there. You go to the next slide, please. You can see a little bit as to what you can see into the distance off of this the fire tower. If you go to the next one, this is not a great slide. I'm not a photographer like John and Woody, so I have to steal mine from where I can get them. But you can see almost 180 degrees around off of this knife end trail. And it's one of the most spectacular places you can ever go in the fall. And I would encourage you, if you've got time, to take a fairly long hike. This again is a 10 to 12 miler. in mid-October, this is a phenomenal place to go. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jimmy. So some of the chat's been really, really good. I've encouraged the questions in the chats and the responses as well. One of them, I think Jennifer Roberts just suggested Table Rock and Hawksbill as being good short hiking trails. And the Linville Gorge area is probably one of my favorites and one of the areas I know best. I spent a summer in the Outward Bound School, has a base camp at Table Rock. So the area in the Linville Gorge is my favorite. So if Nick will pull up my slides, a short hike is to the top of Hawksbill. It's only about a mile in and a mile back from the road. You take the road off of, I think, 181 through area called Ginger Cake Acres, and then to the trailhead of the Hawksbill. And Nick, do you have that slide?
Yep, working on it.
Okay. And then it's a fairly short hike. The last 100 yards is a little bit of a scramble. It's pretty vertical. So you've got to the last 100, 150 yards, but up until that point, it's not that hard of a hike until you get to the very end. And next slide will show the view that you have when you get to the top of Hawksbill. This is obviously on the left and the right kind of fit together, quite frankly. The left, that's Table Rock. And on the right, that's Linville Gorge and Short Off Mountain in the distance. I know Woody and Joyce Fulton are on the call here. Their house is on the other side of the gorge over in Jonas Ridge. So a short hike that is one of my favorites is absolutely Hawksbill. And you get this view, and it's pretty much a 360-degree view when you get to Hawksbill. When I was at the Outward Bound School, we spent 6 days hiking through the gorge and up north. On the next to last day, we hiked in an area near Little Lost Cliffs and Greg Prong, and then we hiked to the top of Grandfather Mountain. The next slide shows, we'll be talking about Grandfather, which is probably a mountain that almost everyone on this Zoom program has been to, and I will talk about how I like to hike it. And 3 ways of getting there. One I don't recommend. With the Outward Bound, we hiked from the south, Little Lost Cove, and the next slide shows the arrow of the route that we took. If those of you who know Grandfather Mountain know that there is no trail coming up from the south where that arrow is. So the next slide shows what that passage looks like if you are hiking from the south side of Grandfather Mountain. To give you some idea what this is like, we had lunch at the construction site of the Lynn Cove Viaduct. This was 1986. And Lynn Cove Viaduct was under construction. We had lunch there. It was late June. We had 2.5 miles to get to the top. We got there right before dark, 8 hours later. Of the ways to get to the top of Grandfather, this is not the one I would recommend. The way most folks get to the top of Grandfather, as our next slide will show, is the profile trail. And that's coming from Linville Gap in 105. The next slide shows why you are likely to go up that way, and that there's a great parking lot there, and it's free parking. You just pull off of 105 into the parking lot and you hike up the profile trail. And it's an easy way to the extent it's easy, it is shorter to get there. The next slide shows, though, that it can be a little bit of a rock scramble. And again, it's well marked. It's easy to get to the top of Callaway Peak, but that's also not my trail of choice. What I would recommend, as shown on the next slide, is it takes 2 cars. So you need 2 vehicles. Park 1 car at the Daniel Boone Trail parking area off the Blue Ridge Road where this red arrow is. Then everyone pile in that car, and then, as the next slide shows, drive around to the swinging bridge. Now, there is an admission to go to the top of the swinging bridge, so there is some expense involved in this. But again, you can tell the guide as you go in that you're going to be through hiking back down. He knows exactly what you're doing. He won't charge you to come back a second time at the end of the day. Once you get to the parking area near the swinging bridge, you'll see the trailhead. I think that's the next slide. Okay, this is the arrow that shows the route up. And then the next slide is the trailhead. So you can't miss it. as to how to get on this trail. You know, it talks about it being difficult. I don't know how difficult it is. I mean, there were children on this trail, but you got to be careful because of some of the ladders and some of the narrow ridges as you're going up. The next slide shows, I believe, some of those ladders. This was a hike on the left. I'm glad to report that the guy on the ladder ahead of me did not fall, and I did not have to catch him, I'm glad to say. But you do have some ladders that you're going on to get up to McCrae's Peak particularly, and then to Callaway Peak. Once you get to Callaway Peak on the next slide, though, I'll get you some idea what the scenes are like, the views are like. This is, I believe, that day, and the weather changes very rapidly. I think this is from McCrae's Peak looking west, and gives you some idea of the view from the top of Grandfather. If you keep going east from McCrae's Peak, you would get to the highest point of Grandfather, which is Callaway Peak. You go through Callaway Gap, and then to Callaway Peak, where we stopped for lunch that day. And again, it's a family hike. So Nick, if you want to go to the next slide, you do have to be careful. There's lots of squirrels. If you have lunch up there, as we did, you need to watch out for your friendly squirrels. But notice in the background on the left, the weather can change very, very quickly. You know how clear it was. McCrae's Peak, that was an hour before this one was taken. And then from Callaway Peak, you can just keep hiking east. And the map will come up on the next slide. And basically, you're through hiking west to east across the top of Callaway Peak, where we had lunch. And then down the other side, you've got one ladder to go down. But then you got a lot of switchbacks. And it's once you get down that one ladder, it's a wonderful hike. It did rain on us. You saw how beautiful it was at McCrae's Peak 3 hours earlier. We put on our ponchos. It was a really wet summer. So lots of mushrooms everywhere, lots of wildflowers. And then you wind back around, and there's 2 or 3 different options as you're getting back to your car, but you wind back around to where you started from, as shown on the next slide. You've got a car there waiting for you. Then you can drive back to where the second car was, where you started that hike. And again, this is probably about, well, you know, I mean, you can take all day if you, or you could take probably 3 or 4 hours. But, you know, if you start early, you get back there in the middle of the afternoon, as we did. That storm had passed. Fortunately, there was no lightning. You don't want to be up there. And again, the next slide shows the view from that parking area with Barbara in the foreground there. So again, it's just a great way to get across Grandfather Mountain without going up the profile trail. You do have to pay admission. Grandfather Mountain, I did check on their website, is open. You can go up there. There's no, you don't buy tickets at the gate like you normally do. You have to buy them in advance on the internet. But it is open, and it's a great way, in my opinion, the best way to go up Grandfather, much better than the southern route through all the rhododendron brambles. So up to this point, we've talked about a lot of hikes that are fairly remote. Will take the better part of a day. Adventures of the risk of being caught in a snowstorm like Woody, or a rainstorm like Jimmy or I. But you know, there are a lot of hikes that are right in your backyard. And a lot of you have on the chats have talked about, well, where can I go just for a simple hike if I'm just a beginning hiker? So I'm going to turn it over to my former classmate, Leslie Knight, to talk about, you know, hikes that may be closer than you think.
Let's see,